am Michelle Singletary, personal finance columnist for the Washington Post, and I'm so honored and pleased to have with me today Nicholas Bednar, law professor at the University of Minnesota, who has been great in explaining the deferred resignation offer by the Office of Personnel Management to federal employees across the country. He was so gracious to talk to me for a column that I wrote trying to help people decide whether or not they should take this offer. So Nick, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Michelle.
So let's jump right in it. The big question, and we'll walk through what might be right or wrong about this offer, but the big question on everybody's mind is, should I take this offer? Or maybe I should back up. Maybe the question is this legal?
Sure. I can answer both, and we can get into why I come to these conclusions. Is it legal? Probably not. There are a lot of legal holes in here. The program seems to be violating a lot of different statutes that are enacted into law, and so it rests on very dubious grounds. And anyone considering this offer should really think about that before they choose to sign, right? We don't know if this offer is valid. We don't know if a court's going to uphold it. We have at least one lawsuit seeking to strike down the entirety of the offer. And so anyone who signs takes a very significant risk that this offer won't ultimately be upheld. And that risk might be appropriate for some people, but for a lot of people, it's probably not going to be worth it.
So that's a good segue to the next question is should you take it? So you said that it might be good for some. Let's talk about who it's not good for, and then the small swath of folks that might figure, well, what the heck?
Yeah. Overall, I think if you are a standard career employee in the federal government, you have a lot of protections in the event of a reduction in force. You have due process rights that protect you from being terminated. And those protections exist for a reason. They exist to prevent presidents from pushing civil servants out during a presidential transition. And that's really what we're seeing here. So I think the majority of federal workers already sort of have rights that would be beneficial. Now, who should take it? I mean, my bottom line is ultimately, I think anyone who takes it is going to take a substantial risk, right? Anyone should be prepared that this offer might not be upheld. It might not pay out for the reasons we're going to talk about. But in talking to civil servants, and I'm not necessarily advising that these two groups of people take this offer, the two groups who have expressed the greatest concern to me personally are individuals who are close to retirement. They see this as an opportunity to leave kind of the chaos of Washington, D.C. right now. They know their retirement benefits will kick in soon. Um, the second group who is considering it, and I think is quite unfortunate, is individuals who are disabled and who work from home. And they view this as an opportunity to avoid the return to office requirements that have been put in place and to really, have this space to try and figure out where they're going to go next because they no longer view the federal government as an acceptable place to work for them because it can't accommodate their needs.
Yeah. And so for both groups, and you and I talked about this for the column, so one of the risks is because it may not be legal, because there's some things that might go against what's on statute, you actually might be putting yourself in more risk by taking it than not taking it, because you've got things on the table now that protect you. If you resign, does that change your status in your ability to take advantage of those statutes that are there to protect you?
Yeah, so it's complicated. So there are two things. One is there's this they've sent around this contract that they want individuals who are taking the program to sign. And paragraph 12 says that individuals who sign are going to give up their judicial and administrative remedies with respect to both this program and anything to do with their employment while they're at the agency. And that's quite a waiver of rights. So, you know, if you sign this document, the document itself purports to say you have no remedies to enforce this agreement, to resolve any other complaints you may have had while at the agency. Now, whether a court will uphold that provision, I don't know. There are statutes that and certain procedural things that cannot be waived for federal employees. But it's hard to analyze all of that with one day until the deadline. And you really want to think about, are you comfortable giving up your right to have this reviewed by a court if that's
And
what a court decides?
And for a regular person, you're working in your federal job, even if somehow you could fight it, that means hiring an attorney, right? That means doing some things that you might not be in a position to be able to do in terms of hiring someone and the long process of fighting for your rights, even though you might win in the end. I mean, you and I both know the courts could go either way, and it is very expensive to proceed with a lawsuit.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I can tell you as a law professor and someone who surrounds himself with law practitioners that this is not a cheap endeavor, right? So, don't the other thing I'll say too is it's not only the cost, right? There's current law, like Supreme Court precedent, that suggests if this order is unlawful, employees can't force employees can't force courts to enforce the offer
Yeah,
because
I
it's
saw that. I'm
yeah.
sorry, let me interrupt you, but I saw that, and you did a blog post, an excellent blog post, by the way, and I hope people go and read it on Lawfare. And you walk through some of the court cases, but I saw that about the Supreme Court that even if people are getting bad information, and a lot of the information about these orders, this offer is coming through FAQs, that you can't rely on that as bad faith information if you do end up in court. Is that what you were saying in terms of that case
Yeah.
before the
Yeah.
Supreme Court?
Yeah, so you can imagine the way you would bring this lawsuit, right? Say that for whatever reason, the federal government reneges on its deal and it doesn't pay you out. And we can talk about why that might happen in a second. But what the federal government is likely to argue is that, well, the contract was illegal anyway.
Hmm.
And you can't go to court and say, well, they told me it was lawful because they didn't have the authority to make those payments at that time when they
Wow.
entered into this agreement. And
Wow.
so, even if paragraph 12 wasn't there, this waiver of rights, I'm really concerned that the courts still wouldn't find a remedy, even if you could get into court.
Wow, that's pretty devastating to people who've worked really hard for the American public. So let's walk through with the parts of this, either the offer or the agreement that you find could be unlawful, because federal employees through their agencies have been sending out messages like this is legit. You shouldn't worry about it, and there's some question of whether or not those emails are being forced, right,
Yeah.
by career people who are afraid of their jobs, right? I mean,
Yeah.
when you read it, and I'm getting information from employees that the agency's management is in a fog themselves, but are being forced to send out these emails that say, oh, don't worry, this is legal, which is, I mean, just crazy. So if you could walk people through why you think that various parts are perhaps unlawful.
Yeah, so let me start at somewhat of a high level and just talk about what benefits this agreement purports to provide federal employees who resign. So the terms of the agreement, and it has changed so much that it's hard to know exactly what the terms of the agreement are, and that itself is concerning. But some of the central tenets have remained the same. So let me just talk about those central tenets first, and then I'll tell you why we should be concerned about some of those. So the program offers federal employees an opportunity to resign effective September 30th. So you are announcing your resignation. It will be effective September 30th. And in exchange, it offers a couple different things. The first is it says you do not have to return to the office. So if you are already working from home, you're not required. There's an executive order that has required federal employees to return to the office. You're not required to do so if you choose to resign. Now, one thing there is most federal employees don't actually work from home. The vast majority of them go into the office for some significant period of the week. So I don't know if that's enough to entice people.
Yeah, that's a good
So
point. Great point.
And the other provisions, right? One of them is that we'll continue to pay you no matter what your workload is until September 30th. The other provision is we're going to put you on administrative leave. And what they've said about administrative leave has fluctuated a lot. So at the beginning, they said, well, it's up to your agency leader. If the agency leader thinks that there's, significant reasons that you should remain in your job, you agree to continue to do so. Uh, then one of the FAQs changed that to say, there's this question of, do I have to continue to work at my federal job while if I participate in this program? And it responded very simply, no.
No.
And now they seem to have gone back to the agency leader can decide. But I truly do not know what they envision. But there's
Right.
this proposed administrative leave that would put you on leave from March to September 30th. The final thing is that it says you can receive private sector employment. So
Oh,
they
can we
say,
go back before you jump on that
yeah,
about the administrative leave? Because,
yeah,
as you said, at first they said there is room for you to for your to you to stay at home and get paid, and then it says, now the agency has the authority to say no. Then it went back to and then the agreement, the contract said it may be up to the agency. Can you talk a little bit about in the contract that they sent around? It said something like rare circumstances. Um,
yeah.
and that gives them that out. That's that huge loophole that you drive a Mack truck through that would allow, a manager to say, listen, I need some work done. And whether you resign or not, you want to stay here to September 30th. And then that takes off the table one of the big benefits that they touted for you to sign this crazy offer, right?
Yeah. So, what are rare circumstances? I don't know. Um, Consider the following, though. We're in the middle of a hiring freeze, and if enough people in a given agency take this, there are certain functions that have to be performed by law, right? And that even President Trump isn't going to let lapse. Social security checks need to be sent. There's a bunch of
We're in the
trade
middle of
pol
tax season.
we're in the middle of tax season, right? There's a bunch of trade policy President Trump wants to implement, right? So I don't know what rare circumstances mean, but you can imagine maybe they're not as rare as this contract says. And you're absolutely right, right? If the key benefit of this program is, we're going to put you on administrative leave, go find a private sector job, take a nice vacation is like one of the things they wrote on the FAQ, right? All this is, if you take that away, is you are giving a 2 weeks notice 8 months in advance
Right.
and agreeing to work from home, which you may not be able to work from home because certain federal jobs, you can't have access to the information unless you are already in the office.
Right. And then the threat, one of the reasons why I think this contract is so dishonest is one graph says, you're doing this voluntarily, not under duress. But if you're threatening people that if they don't sign, you could lose your job. I don't know. You're the law professor. You've got a lot more training in this. That seems to be the definition of coercion. Um,
Yeah.
what do people make of that? I mean,
It's really hard to know. So it is true under law that a federal employee who resigns has to do so voluntarily. And does this qualify as voluntary when you have all of these threats, right? And I don't know what a court would decide. And that's concerning, right? It is true that you are permitted to rescind your resignation in the event that you have been negligently misled. I don't know if a court would find that employees have been negligently misled. I just don't know. And I think in order to understand why they might be negligently misled, we have to talk a bit about the law, which I think is where we were going next, right? As to what are the legal challenges with this. So again, we talked about the benefits, and I think each of those benefits raises its own legal concern. So let's just talk about the pay, because I think this is the big legal hurdle here. So the federal government is funded by Congress, by the Constitution, right? Congress has to decide all dollars that are going to be spent by federal agencies. Currently, the federal government is only funded through March 14th, and the Anti-Deficiency Act prohibits any agency from obligating funds beyond March 14th. And that includes agency salaries. And so what they are purporting to do is enter into an agreement of we're going to pay you until September 30th, which means funds between March 14th and September 30th, but they don't have authorization to make that promise because Congress hasn't authorized those funds. So what happens if Congress doesn't authorize those funds, right? There are a couple scenarios that could happen. One, maybe Congress ratifies what President Trump has done and says, look, there's this deferred resignation program. We're going to make sure these people get paid. We're also going to adjust the laws on administrative leave, which we'll talk about in a moment, to say we're just going to uphold the end of the bargain.
Right.
That's best case scenario. Worst case scenario is Congress chooses to cut workforce in some of these agencies, doesn't provide enough money to cover all of the salaries of both the employees who remain at the agency and the individuals who take the deferred resignation offer. And therefore, some of these individuals who are on deferred resignation are cut off of their salaries and don't
Right.
get paid.
Right.
So I think that's the biggest risk here is
Yeah. And in that case, to give people an example, let's use the IRS. There are functions that have to be done. You take this offer, they say you could stay at home and not work and take a vacation, but that function has to be done. The tax returns have to be processed. So if Congress authorized the appropriation for that particular job, then that means that there's two people that would be in that place to try to get that same dollars for a function that has to be done. The person who has to do it on site or however, and the person who's taken this vaccination and is at home, and so they say on some Caribbean island drinking margaritas, right? There's
yeah,
not that $1 can't support both of those people. That's basically what you're saying. Is that
right,
correct?
right, exactly. And so if you think about this, right, like if the agency had a free choice, and I'll talk about this in a second, it's a fairly obvious choice as an organization as to who gets the dollar, right?
Right,
Do you give the dollar to the person who is in the job doing the function, or the person who said they're going to leave on September 30th regardless, right?
right,
It's a pretty clear choice, at least to me.
yeah,
Here's the complication there. The contract says that individuals won't be terminated. They won't lose their job in the event of a reduction in force. Reduction in force is just the word we use to describe when this happens, when there's a funding shortfall and we have to lower the number of personnel in an agency. So now what the contract is saying, actually, what the contract is saying in basic terms, right, is actually the person who had deferred resignation is going to get the dollar, not the person who's actually doing the job.
right.
But there's a bunch of law that governs and protects employees in the event of reduction in force, and it creates an order that the government has to work through. And so, even if you're not a federal employee who's taking this job or who's taking this offer, right? You should be very concerned about the existence of this program at all because there's a
Oh.
chance that these individuals, right, who take the offer are going to be given the money and you're going to be forced out of the job.
So it upends that order that would be in place in the case of a RIF. Wow,
Right.
that's very interesting. Um, Moving forward, you were starting to talk about this whole idea that you could take a second job
Yes.
because people are very interested in that. So I'm getting paid by the federal government, and I can also get another paycheck, which gives me an opportunity to basically double dip in some ways. Can you
Yeah.
talk about the legality of that?
Yeah. So it's complicated, as all of this is. So the offer says, and in fact, the FAQ says, we want you to take private sector jobs. Like The administration believes that is the more productive use of the workforce's time than working for the government. There is technically nothing for most federal employees. I'm going to talk about the average career civil servant that prevents them from having a second job. Many federal employees work a second job to support their families, to get a little bit of extra income. There's nothing in law that prohibits that theoretically. But there are a bunch of conflict of interest laws and ethics laws that limit what type of work an individual can perform while on the federal government's payroll. And those conflict of interest laws are really hard to navigate, particularly if, right, you're someone like an attorney who is going to end up representing people who probably
Mhm.
have some interest with the federal government, right? Or you go work for a federal contractor. Federal contractors love to hire federal employees, but you almost immediately have a conflict of interest, right?
Right.
And that opens you up to criminal liability. And so, the contract does say, look, you have to follow these conflict of interest and ethics laws, but I don't know to what extent the average federal worker can actually navigate which jobs aren't going to create an immediate conflict for them because the federal government is just so involved and enmeshed in how the economy operates.
Right. That's so interesting. So you could be taking a risk. And if you are a skilled civil servant, service employee, you would probably want to go to a company that could take advantage of those skill sets because that's what's going to pay you the most. You're not going to probably work at Walmart. Nothing wrong with working at Walmart, but if you are a skilled attorney, you're going to try to find that type of job because that's going to pay you more. But then that bumps up against that whole ethics and conflict of interest. And interesting, the FAQ basically was like, yeah, go get another job. And then the contract says, well, and then that backs it out. So that's that whole, duplicity and the information that is out there for workers. Could someone take a job and work the same hours that their federal job would be paying them?
So, so yeah, it's really weird. I have yet to find anything that prohibits that particular issue, but it's so strange, right? And it doesn't seem like something, even if it were lawful, that should be allowed to be done. There are so many different ways they could have designed this program that wouldn't have had these bizarre consequences. In fact, federal law has different ways for um, the president and agencies to actually pay people to voluntarily separate. But that's not what this program is.
Right. That's right.
And so,
That's
all these questions you're asking, a lot of my answers to some degree are, I don't know, because this is so unprecedented. And we have systems that this is supposed to follow. And it's very alarming that those aren't the systems that are being used.
Yeah. And my fear is the government has lawyers. Well, maybe they'll have some lawyers still, but a regular person who gets in trouble of this, now putting yourself in more financial jeopardy to fight, and maybe you'll win in the end. But I've been subject to going into court for different things, and you don't know how that's going to end, and that could cause a great deal amount of money. Are there other parts of the contract that concern you that you need to point out to those who have still like what 1 day to decide whether to take this offer?
So I'll just, hit a couple little things before we wrap up. So first, I think, the contract says we're going to put you on administrative leave from March to September. We have already talked about the potential problems of that in terms of, the rare circumstances thing. The other point I'll raise is that the Administrative Leave Act of 2016 says that employees can only go on leave, or the agency can only put employees on leave for a period of 10 days in a calendar year. Now, there are some Biden era regulations that complicate that analysis slightly. Whether those regulations are valid raises a significant question. Um, But that's another reason we might think this is unlawful. And again, is one of the central reasons that people would consider to take this, and it should be,
Right,
concerning.
right.
The other thing I'll raise too, and just, one final consideration for people. I think part of the reason that this deal is coming out is it's a reflection of individuals who've mostly managed a private sector workforce. And they presume that federal workers are incentivized primarily by money. But a lot of these federal workers took a pay cut to take the jobs they want, and it's because they want to work in public service. And the federal government provides them that opportunity. And that opportunity doesn't exist as readily in the private sector. And so, I think individuals who are hesitating because they're realizing that they're doing work that's very fulfilling to their values, and they don't know that that opportunity will arise in another job.
I'm so glad you brought that up because some of the criticism of what I wrote and maybe what even you wrote that, well, nobody gets this in the private sector. So why should they have all these protections? Why should they have job security when I don't have it in the private sector? And while that is a good, I mean, that's a valid point that, people want their jobs to be protected. We're talking about a group of people that are different
Yeah.
and performing tasks that serve a great amount of Americans. And so the protections are there for the very reasons that you just said. My husband worked for the federal government for almost 30 years. He could have made more money. He's a mechanical engineer, but he was in a program. Don't get me started. He was in a program that was helping small manufacturers, and he felt like that was a mission for him. And for our family, it was okay that he wasn't making more in the private sector because he was doing a service to help small manufacturers, who, by the way, mostly, small employers are the people who employ most of Americans.
Yeah.
And so we, as a family, decided that that was something that he wanted to do to serve. And so it is, I don't think it's unfair that they have certain protections. And now we know why some of those are in place because we're hearing that people are asking, who did you vote for? This loyalty test.
Mhm.
When you work for the federal government and IRS and Social Security and Medicare and Medicare, what you do privately in terms of your voting history is vastly different than that person who calls you. You're not asking them if they're a Democrat or Republican. That person who says, should I take my Social Security? What's going on? You're not asking them, who did they vote for? You're saying, let me help you figure out how to apply for Social Security. And that's why those job protections are there for this group of people. It's not people who are sitting around eating bonbons, watching, reruns of Oprah. These are people who have decided that this is the kind of work that they want to do. And isn't it right that they have those kind of protections if they have taken sacrifices in terms of finances to do that job?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And it hits the nail on the head of why we have this whole system, right? When we established the system in 1883, what we really wanted was dedicated individuals who would bring their expertise to help the public. And that's what the civil service does.
Yeah,
And, I think setting even this program aside, right, it's going to be a challenge for the next 4 years. And I think the public has a very large role to play in supporting the civil service and letting them know that we really value the work they do.
right,
Because the public's going to be the individuals who suffer if these civil servants go away, right? These civil
right,
servants, like in terms of their pay, like they're in a very difficult decision. Most of them will get hired with a premium. There are companies and contractors who will offer bonuses to former federal employees because they bring this level of expertise and inside knowledge of government. But the people who get hurt, right, are us when our mail doesn't get delivered, our social security check doesn't get signed, our tax return takes a long time to process.
right, right. So I'll ask you this last question. We kind of began with that. And you don't represent people personally. So we're taking this, I'm asking this question from the perspective of someone who studied this. And that's the other thing, for those who are listening or watching, Nick is skilled. I mean, he has researched this, he has a history of looking at the federal workforce. So this is not some random attorney, y'all. um, What would you advise people who, if this is the 11th hour and their hands are in their head, they've got family to support. In some cases, both spouses work for the federal government. Um, what should they do? And how do they edit out all the stuff out there to make the best decision for themselves based on the FAQs, this agreement that was presented before them?
Yeah. So I'm going to give the very law professor answer, right? Which is I don't know what any individual should do. I think for the vast majority of civil service, this isn't the right deal. And if you're considering it, I would strongly advise that you read Michelle's column, you read the stuff I've written at Lawfare, you really look at what the federal unions have put out. Even if you're not a part of the union, they're, providing arguments as to why this might be um, a bad deal for you. And I think you should really go in informed and you should know that it might not pay out. And you should have a backup plan if it doesn't pay out. I don't think anyone should think that they're getting a vacation until September 30th, right? You should know how you're paying your salary beyond March 14th if you choose to take this deal.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you so much. I will be continue to talk to you even after this offer closes. I'm sure there'll be other things coming down the pike. I really appreciate your expertise and taking the time to help people sort through whether this offer is best for them.
Thank you for having me, Michelle.